Before this story begins, I want to ask you something very simple. Have you ever felt that something inside you has been quietly waiting for many years? Not anger, not sadness, just a quiet part of you that was never fully heard. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about growing up, about learning to listen to yourself, and about becoming the person you once needed. So take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let the story begin. Hello, and thank you for spending this quiet moment here with me. Before this story truly begins, I want you to imagine something very simple. Imagine holding a photograph from your childhood. Not a perfect photo, not one carefully posed for an album, but an ordinary one. Maybe the colors are slightly faded. Maybe the background is messy, but the child in that photo is unmistakably you. Now imagine looking into that child's eyes and asking a quiet question. What did you need back then that you never received? For many years, I never asked myself that question. My name is Carter. And for most of my life, I carried a quiet sadness that I didn't fully understand. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't interrupt my daily life in obvious ways. I still went to school, later went to work, built friendships, and smiled in photographs. From the outside, my life appeared completely normal. But inside, there was always a subtle heaviness. It felt like a small ache somewhere deep in my chest, not painful enough to stop me from living, but present enough to remind me that something inside me had never been fully at peace. For a long time, I blamed adulthood. I believed that this quiet sadness was simply what life felt like once childhood ended. People often say that growing up means becoming more serious, more responsible, more realistic. I assumed that losing a sense of lightness was simply the price of maturity. So I ignored the feeling and kept moving forward. Years passed. I worked hard, just like everyone else around me. I tried to be dependable, tried to be kind, tried to become someone others could rely on. Yet, no matter how much I accomplished, that small sadness remained. It followed me quietly through my days. Sometimes it appeared late at night when the world became silent. Sometimes it surfaced during conversations when someone asked how I was really doing. And sometimes it appeared in unexpected moments of stillness. What I didn't understand then was that the sadness was not coming from my present life. It was coming from my past. More specifically, it belonged to a younger version of me who had never truly been heard. When I was a child, I was sensitive. Not weak, just sensitive. I noticed small details that others overlooked. I paid close attention to people's moods and could sense when someone was upset even if they said nothing. My imagination was vivid, and I often spent time creating stories in my mind. But sensitivity can easily be misunderstood. When I felt overwhelmed, adults sometimes told me I was too emotional. When I asked too many questions, I was told to stop overthinking. And when I felt hurt, I was often told to be strong. None of these responses were meant to harm me. The adults around me were doing the best they could with what they understood at the time. But the message I absorbed was simple and powerful. My feelings were inconvenient. So I learned something very early in life. I learned to hide them. Instead of expressing sadness, I stayed quiet. Instead of asking for comfort, I pretended I was fine. Instead of saying what I needed, I focused on what others needed. Children are incredibly adaptable. If love feels conditional, they quickly learn how to adjust themselves in order to keep it. I adapted by becoming easy to manage. Teachers liked me because I caused no trouble. Family members often described me as mature for my age. But maturity, in my case, meant something very different. It meant I had learned to abandon parts of myself that seemed inconvenient to others. The sensitive child did not disappear. She simply became silent. Years passed, and that silence followed me into adulthood. I became someone who listened carefully to others, but rarely spoke about my own feelings. I offered support easily, but struggled to ask for help. I comforted friends during their difficult moments, yet when my own emotions surfaced, I minimized them. I told myself I was independent, that I didn't need much from anyone. But independence can sometimes hide loneliness. The turning point in my life arrived on a completely ordinary evening. Nothing dramatic happened that day. I had simply returned home after work and started cleaning my apartment. While organizing a drawer, I found a small envelope filled with old photographs. Most of them were from childhood. Curious, I sat down on the floor and began flipping through them slowly. There were pictures from birthday parties, school events, and family trips. Each image captured a moment that felt distant and faint, like memories half hidden behind fog. Then I found one photograph that made me stop. In the picture, I looked about 7 years old. I was standing outside in sunlight, holding something small in my hands. My hair was messy, and my smile was gentle, but slightly uncertain. But what caught my attention most were my eyes. There was a fragile hope in them, a quiet openness that felt almost heartbreaking to look at now. I sat there for several minutes just staring at that child in the photograph, and then a question appeared in my mind so clearly that it almost felt like someone else had spoken it aloud. Who protected her? The question surprised me. I looked again at the photo. The child looked hopeful, but also vulnerable in a way I had never noticed before. Another question followed quietly behind the first one. Who told her she was allowed to feel what she felt? Who told her she didn't have to be perfect? Who told her she was not a burden? The answers came slowly, but they were painfully simple. No one. Not in the way she truly needed. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I suddenly understood something that had been hidden from me for years. The sadness I had been carrying did not belong to the adult version of me. It belonged to that child, the child who had learned to stay quiet, the child who had waited patiently for someone to finally listen. Sitting there on the floor, holding that photograph, I felt a quiet realization unfold inside me. For the first time, I did not see my younger self as a distant memory. I saw her as someone who was still living quietly within me. And with that realization came another thought, gentle but powerful. If no one had protected her back then, maybe I could protect her now. At first, the idea felt strange. How could an adult protect a child who only existed in memory? But the more I sat with that thought, the clearer it became. Healing does not require rewriting the past. It requires changing how the past continues to live inside you. Perhaps the most powerful thing I could do was surprisingly simple. I could become the person she had needed all along. That realization did not fix everything overnight. The sadness did not disappear instantly, and the years of silence did not vanish in a single moment. But something important had begun. It marked the beginning of a different kind of journey. not a journey to become someone impressive, and not a journey to achieve more success in the eyes of others. Instead, it became a journey to become a safe place for myself. And that journey began with a quiet promise I made while sitting on the floor with that old photograph in my hands. From that day forward, I would not abandon that child again. After that evening, life did not suddenly become easier. There was no dramatic transformation the next morning, no moment where I woke up feeling completely healed or emotionally strong. Instead, I woke up with something much simpler, but far more powerful: awareness. Once you notice a wounded part of yourself, it becomes almost impossible to ignore it again. For many years, I had been living as if that younger version of me no longer existed. I believed that becoming an adult meant leaving childhood behind completely, as if the past could simply be sealed away and forgotten. But after finding that photograph, I began to understand something very different. The child we once were never truly disappears. She simply waits. Sometimes she waits quietly in the background of our lives, barely noticeable. Other times, she waits with a quiet pain that we cannot fully explain. But no matter how deeply we try to bury her, she is always there. Once I saw her again in that photograph, I could no longer pretend she didn't exist. In the days that followed, I began paying attention to my emotions in a way I never had before. Instead of pushing them aside or ignoring them, I paused and tried to understand them. Whenever I felt anxious, hurt, or overwhelmed, I asked myself a simple and gentle question. What would that 7-year-old version of me need right now? At first, the answers surprised me with their simplicity. She didn't need perfection. She didn't need achievement. She didn't need someone to tell her to be stronger. What she needed most was reassurance. She needed kindness. She needed someone to say, "You are allowed to feel this." For most of my life, the voice inside my head had been harsh and demanding. Whenever I made a mistake, my inner voice immediately criticized me. Whenever I felt afraid, I told myself to stop being weak. Whenever I struggled, I forced myself to keep pushing forward without rest, believing that stopping would mean failure. I had always thought this harshness made me stronger, that discipline and self-criticism were necessary for growth. But now I began to see the truth more clearly. That harshness had never made me stronger. It had only made me lonelier. So I decided to experiment with a different way of treating myself. When I felt tired, I allowed myself to rest instead of pushing harder. When I felt sad, I allowed myself to sit quietly with the feeling instead of distracting myself immediately with work or noise. When I made mistakes, I tried to speak to myself the way I would speak to a frightened child, with gentleness, patience, and without judgment. At first, this felt incredibly uncomfortable. Part of me believed I was becoming lazy or overly sensitive. That critical voice had been with me for so many years that it didn't disappear overnight. It whispered that I was losing my edge, that I was becoming weaker. But slowly, another voice began to grow stronger inside me. It was calmer, quieter, and far kinder. And that voice reminded me of something I had never truly understood before. Strength does not come from ignoring pain. Real strength comes from learning how to care for it. One of the first major changes this new awareness brought into my life involved boundaries. As a child, I had learned to prioritize other people's comfort over my own feelings. If someone was upset, I immediately tried to fix it. If someone needed help, I said yes without hesitation. Saying no had always felt dangerous to me because I feared disappointing people or losing their approval. This habit followed me into adulthood more than I realized. I accepted responsibilities that overwhelmed me. I stayed in conversations that left me emotionally drained. I tolerated situations that quietly hurt me simply because I didn't want to cause conflict. But something shifted when I began imagining that younger version of myself watching the choices I made. I started asking a different question. Would I allow someone to treat that child the way I sometimes allowed others to treat me? The answer was immediate and clear: no. So I began practicing a new word that had always felt uncomfortable before: no. I didn't say it loudly or aggressively. I simply said it clearly and honestly when something didn't feel right for me. The first time I said no to something I didn't want to do, my heart raced with anxiety. I expected the other person to become angry or disappointed. I expected conflict. I expected rejection. But none of those things happened. The other person simply said, "Okay." That moment surprised me more than I expected. For years, I had believed that boundaries would destroy relationships. Instead, they clarified them. Some people respected my honesty immediately. Others needed a little time to adjust to the change. And a few relationships slowly faded away. At first, losing those connections felt uncomfortable. But over time, I realized something important. Not every relationship survives honesty, but the ones that do become stronger, healthier, and far more genuine. Each time I chose to protect my emotional well-being, I imagined speaking to that younger version of myself and telling her something simple but powerful: "I'm here for you now." Sometimes protecting her meant leaving a conversation that felt harmful. Sometimes it meant choosing rest instead of overworking myself. Sometimes it meant admitting that something had hurt me instead of pretending it didn't matter. These small acts of self-protection felt surprisingly powerful. For the first time in my life, I wasn't abandoning myself in order to keep others comfortable. I was standing beside myself. Another change unfolded, slowly but steadily. I began listening to my emotions instead of running away from them. When fear appeared, I didn't immediately distract myself the way I used to. Instead, I paused and asked what the fear might be trying to tell me. More often than not, fear wasn't an enemy at all. It was information. Sometimes it warned me that a boundary was being crossed. Sometimes it reminded me that I was stepping into something meaningful but unfamiliar. And sometimes it simply told me that I needed rest. Sadness also began to feel different. In the past, sadness had felt like something I needed to fix or escape from as quickly as possible. Now, it felt more like a message. It reminded me that something inside me deserved attention and care. One evening, after a particularly emotional day, I sat quietly on my couch and noticed something unexpected. I wasn't trying to fix my past anymore. I wasn't searching for a way to erase old memories or rewrite childhood experiences. Instead, I was learning something much more meaningful. I was learning how to care for myself in the present moment. That realization felt quietly powerful. Healing, I understood, does not require us to travel back in time or undo what has already happened. Healing asks something much simpler and more compassionate. It asks us to offer ourselves the kindness we once needed but never received. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something beautiful began to change inside me. The sadness I had carried for so many years began to soften. It didn't disappear completely, but it transformed. Instead of feeling like a heavy shadow that followed me everywhere, it began to feel more like a quiet memory, a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. Of course, there were still difficult days. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, or when I doubted whether I was truly changing. But even during those moments, something inside me remained steady. I was no longer facing those feelings alone, because the adult version of me had finally learned how to care for the child within me, and that changed everything. The little girl in that photograph no longer felt abandoned. She had someone now, someone who listened, someone who protected her, someone who spoke kindly to her when the world felt overwhelming. She had me, and the journey of becoming the person she needed had only just begun. As the months passed, something subtle began to change inside me. At first, the change was so quiet that I almost didn't notice it. From the outside, my life still looked completely ordinary. I woke up each morning and went to work. In the evenings, I returned home, answered messages, talked with friends, and handled my responsibilities just as I always had. Nothing dramatic had shifted in my daily routine. Yet internally, something was slowly becoming softer. For many years, my inner world had felt like a place I avoided. Whenever uncomfortable emotions appeared, I immediately distracted myself with work, conversations, or endless activity. Silence felt dangerous because silence created space for feelings to rise to the surface. As long as I stayed busy, I could keep those feelings hidden somewhere in the background. But now, little by little, I began allowing that silence back into my life. Sometimes, after dinner, I would sit alone in my living room without turning on the television. I would leave my phone on the table and simply sit there with nothing to do. At first, those moments felt strangely unfamiliar. My mind kept reaching for something to fill the space, something to scroll through, something to watch, something to consume. The urge to distract myself was strong, but slowly, I learned to stay, and when I stayed long enough, I began hearing something I had ignored for years, my own voice, not the voice of expectations that told me what I should be doing, not the voice of responsibility reminding me of tasks and obligations, but a quieter voice that had been waiting patiently beneath everything else for a very long time. That voice asked simple questions. What do you actually want? What makes you feel alive? What makes you feel peaceful? For a long time, I had organized my life around what seemed practical and safe. I chose stability over curiosity. I chose security over expression. At the time, those choices felt reasonable. They were the kinds of decisions adults are often praised for making. But gradually, I began to realize that while those choices had created a stable life, they had also created a life that felt emotionally distant. Instead of trying to change everything dramatically, I began reconsidering those choices gently. I started paying attention to small things that made me feel more like myself again. I took slow walks in the park without rushing or checking my phone. I began writing thoughts in a small notebook, not because anyone would read them, but simply because the act of writing helped me understand myself better. Sometimes I listened to music that stirred something emotional inside me. Music that reminded me of feelings I had forgotten how to experience. These moments were small and simple, but they felt meaningful, and slowly, something else began to return to my life. Dreams, not the kind of dreams we usually discuss in professional conversations or career planning. These were quieter dreams, the kind we carry as children before the world teaches us to be cautious and practical. When I was young, I used to imagine many different futures. I imagined creating things, traveling to places I had never seen, learning new languages, meeting people from different cultures. I felt curious about the world in a way that felt natural and joyful. But adulthood had made me careful about taking risks, careful about failing, careful about disappointing the expectations of others. Now, when those childhood dreams returned to my thoughts, they didn't feel unrealistic anymore. They felt unfinished. One of the first steps I took toward reconnecting with that curiosity was small but deeply symbolic. I signed up for an online English-speaking group that met once a week. The idea felt intimidating at first. Speaking another language meant exposing my mistakes. It meant sounding uncertain, searching for words, and sometimes saying things incorrectly. For many years, that kind of vulnerability would have stopped me immediately. But something inside me wanted to try anyway. The first meeting felt awkward. My sentences came out slowly, and sometimes I paused for several seconds while trying to remember the right words. There were moments when I felt embarrassed by my hesitation. But something surprising happened during that first session. No one laughed. No one judged. Everyone else in the group was learning too. We all stumbled over grammar. We all forgot vocabulary. Sometimes we helped each other finish sentences when someone got stuck. The atmosphere was patient and encouraging in a way I hadn't expected. During one of those meetings, I suddenly noticed a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. Excitement, not the nervous excitement of performing well or impressing others, but the quiet excitement that comes from learning something new. Every new phrase felt like opening a small door to another world. Every conversation revealed possibilities I hadn't considered before. English was no longer just a skill I wanted to improve. It became a bridge connecting me to people, ideas, and perspectives beyond the boundaries of my familiar environment. More importantly, it helped me reconnect with the curious child I used to be each time I spoke. Even when my sentences were imperfect, I imagined that younger version of myself watching quietly. She was the child who once felt afraid to take up space, the child who believed her voice might be inconvenient or too much for others. Now she could see something different. She could see an adult who was willing to try, willing to make mistakes, willing to speak anyway. And each time I spoke, even when my voice trembled slightly with nervousness, I felt something shift inside me. It felt as if that younger version of myself was standing somewhere behind me, whispering softly, "Thank you." Not because my English was perfect, but because I was finally allowing myself to exist more fully in the world. Outside those weekly language meetings, the changes in my life continued slowly. I began speaking more honestly with my friends, instead of automatically saying what I thought they wanted to hear. I expressed my opinions instead of quietly agreeing with everything. I also learned to listen to my own needs before promising help to others. None of these changes were dramatic or sudden, but they were deeply meaningful. For the first time in my life, I felt as if I was building a relationship with myself, a real relationship, one based on respect instead of pressure, and curiosity instead of criticism. And something remarkable began to happen as a result. The quiet sadness that had followed me for so many years began to dissolve. It didn't disappear entirely, but it softened enough for me to notice the difference. Where there had once been heaviness, there was now space. Where there had once been silence, there was now a voice, my voice. The child in that photograph was no longer waiting for someone else to understand her. She had finally been heard. And the adult version of me was no longer trying to prove my worth through constant effort or perfection. Instead, I was learning something far more valuable. I was learning how to live with honesty. Not perfect honesty, not fearless honesty, just the kind of honesty that grows naturally when you stop hiding from yourself. That honesty slowly became the foundation of everything that followed. And as it grew stronger, something else began growing alongside it. Hope, not the fragile hope of childhood that depends on the approval of other people, but a steadier, deeper kind of hope. The kind that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself. The kind that grows when you begin trusting your own voice. And that hope quietly prepared me for the final part of this journey, because becoming the person I needed when I was younger was never only about healing the past, it was also about building a future where that child could finally feel safe. Time has a quiet way of revealing the changes we rarely notice while they are happening. Months passed after the evening when I first found that photograph. Life continued moving in its ordinary rhythm. Work remained busy, responsibilities continued to demand attention, and the world around me carried on exactly as it always had. Nothing outside of me seemed dramatically different. Yet, inside, something had slowly settled into a new shape. I was no longer living with the constant feeling that something important was missing. Instead, there was a quiet sense of companionship within myself. For most of my life, I had been searching for understanding somewhere outside of me. I wanted someone to see me clearly, to recognize my emotions, to tell me that my feelings made sense. I wanted someone to reassure me that I was not too sensitive, not too emotional, not too complicated. But over time, I began to understand something surprising and deeply comforting. The person who needed to offer that understanding had always been me. Healing did not arrive through dramatic breakthroughs or sudden moments of perfect clarity. It arrived through small acts that I repeated again and again. I listened to myself when emotions appeared instead of pushing them away. I allowed myself to rest when I felt exhausted instead of forcing myself to continue. I spoke honestly when something truly mattered to me, and I protected my boundaries even when doing so felt uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Each of these actions felt small in the moment. None of them looked impressive from the outside, but together they slowly built something powerful within me. Trust in my own voice, trust in my own emotions, trust that I could move through life without abandoning myself along the way. One evening, many months after the day I discovered that photograph, I opened the drawer again. The envelope was still there, resting quietly where I had left it. I took it out and carefully removed the same picture. Then I sat down in the quiet room and looked at it again. The child in the photograph looked exactly the same as before. Her hair was still slightly messy. Her small hands were still holding something I couldn't clearly recognize, and her eyes still carried that fragile mixture of hope and uncertainty. But something had changed, not in the photograph, in me. When I looked at her now, I no longer felt sadness or regret. Instead, I felt warmth. I imagined sitting beside her and speaking gently, the way a caring adult might comfort a child. "You didn't do anything wrong," I would say softly. "You were never too much. You were simply waiting for someone to understand you." For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined that conversation as clearly as I could. And as I did, another realization appeared quietly in my mind. That child was not just someone from my past. She was the beginning of who I am today. Every strength I carry now grew from her sensitivity. Every act of compassion I offer to others began with her ability to feel deeply. The qualities I once believed were weaknesses were actually the roots of my greatest strengths. Sensitivity had taught me empathy. Imagination had taught me creativity. Vulnerability had taught me connection. For many years, I had tried to hide these parts of myself because I believed they made me fragile. I thought the world required toughness and emotional distance. But now I understood something much more meaningful. Those qualities did not make me weak. They made me human, of course. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that realization. There were still difficult days. There were still moments when old fears returned or when self-doubt whispered familiar criticisms in the background of my thoughts. But those voices no longer controlled me the way they once had, because I now knew how to respond. Instead of criticizing myself, I paused. Instead of ignoring my feelings, I listened carefully to what they were trying to tell me. Instead of running away from discomfort, I stayed with it long enough to understand it. This simple shift changed the way I moved through the world. I became more patient with others because I had learned patience with myself. I became more comfortable with silence because I no longer feared what might appear within it. And I became more willing to speak honestly because I knew my voice deserved to exist. Strangely enough, learning English became part of this transformation. Whenever I spoke in English, I was often imperfect. I searched for the right words. I paused between sentences. Sometimes I made mistakes or forgot vocabulary in the middle of speaking. But instead of feeling embarrassed about those moments, I began to appreciate them. Speaking another language required humility. It required patience. It required courage. And those qualities reflected the emotional journey I had been experiencing inside myself. Learning English was no longer just about communication. It became a daily reminder that growth always includes uncertainty. You try, you make mistakes, you learn, and then you continue. Life follows the same pattern. We grow through imperfect attempts. We heal through imperfect understanding. We move forward through imperfect courage. Several months later, I attended one of the same English conversation meetings that had once made me so nervous. But this time, something felt different. I still wasn't perfectly fluent, but I felt relaxed. I shared ideas without overthinking every sentence. I laughed when I forgot a word. and I listened carefully when others spoke. After the meeting ended, one of the participants sent me a short message. "I like how calmly you speak," she wrote. "You make the conversation feel comfortable." That message stayed with me for a long time, for years. I had worried that my voice wasn't strong enough, confident enough, or impressive enough. But perhaps strength does not always sound loud or dramatic. Maybe strength sometimes sounds calm. Maybe it sounds patient. Maybe it sounds like someone who has learned how to listen deeply. When I returned home that evening, I placed the childhood photograph back into the envelope. But this time, before putting it away, I did something different. I picked up a pen and wrote a short sentence on the outside of the envelope. "I'm here now." The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that younger versions of me had been waiting a long time to hear. Because the truth is that many of us grow up learning how to take care of others before we learn how to take care of ourselves. We become responsible, dependable, and strong for the people around us. But somewhere along the way, we forget to ask ourselves an important question: who is taking care of us? The answer does not always come from outside. Sometimes it begins with a quiet decision inside ourselves. The decision to stop abandoning our own feelings. The decision to listen when our hearts speak. And the decision to treat ourselves with the same kindness we offer so easily to others. Healing is not about becoming a completely new person. It is about returning to the person you always were before the world convinced you to hide parts of yourself. The child in that photograph did not need to become someone different. She simply needed someone to stand beside her. And now, finally, she has that dot. She has someone who listens, someone who protects her, and someone who understands her. She has me. And if you are listening to this story, perhaps there is also a younger version of you waiting quietly somewhere inside your heart. Maybe that child once felt misunderstood. Maybe that child felt alone. Maybe that child learned to stay silent in order to feel safe. If that is true, I want to leave you with a gentle reminder. It is never too late to return. It is never too late to listen. And it is never too late to become the person you once needed. You do not have to fix everything at once. You only need to begin with one small act of kindness toward yourself. One moment of honesty. One moment of patience. One moment of care. And slowly, moment by moment, you will build something beautiful inside yourself. Place that feels safe. A place where your voice is welcome. A place where your past is understood instead of ignored. A place where you can finally rest, because the person you have been searching for all along may simply be the person you are becoming. And that is more than enough. If this story resonated with you, I want to thank you for staying until the end. These quiet stories are not only about learning English, they are also about learning to understand ourselves. If you would like to continue listening to stories like this, there is another one waiting for you. A story about finding peace after difficult years and learning how to start again. You can listen to it right now. And until we meet again, take care of yourself. Speak kindly to your own heart, and keep moving forward, one small step at a time.